Hello everyone, Sister Shauna here, and I'd like to welcome you to my kitchen here on Love in the Pot. Today, we're finally getting to the cinnamon rolls. I'm sorry for the delays, but it is a perfect time to make them as Passover is approaching. So this is one of those recipes that will help purge the leavening out of your house. If you have instant dry yeast on hand, as I do here, you can definitely make this recipe at home. They can be convenient because you can prep for success and you can make them ahead and freeze them as dough pucks, which I always do. And then when my family's in the mood for a little sweet treat, all I have to do is bake them as desired, as if you were making them from the store-bought version. It's better to eat these, although they are still fattening now. Let's not forget that. Everything in moderation. However, it's better to eat these because they're of good quality. They have whole ingredients and there are no compound names that we can't pronounce, as well as there aren't any preservatives to help give it an extended shelf life. So I recommend, if you're going to indulge in something like this, take the time and make them yourself. You could totally make them far in advance, at least 3 to 6 months in advance, and store them in an airtight package, label it, date it, and put it in your freezer. And whenever you're ready to bake, you can proof them and bake them. So we're gonna get started. Now, to get you through this, I'm just using a simple online recipe. I will post the link in the descriptions box, so check that out so that you too can have full instructions on how to complete this recipe. Now, mind you, I am implementing tips and things I learned in culinary school in my baking courses, so I'm not following the recipe verbatim. I'm gonna do my little spin on it, but it is good to use it as a guide. So I will show you a few baker's tricks and how to prepare these delicious baked goods in your own kitchen. Let's go. Our first step is to heat some milk. And I have 2 cups of milk here because I'm doubling this recipe. Again, I'm trying to purge my house of the leavening. So I'm gonna try to use almost all of this stuff here. And also we'll need to heat 2/3 cup of butter. And that converts to 11 tablespoons. So I'm going to melt that as well. Now, if you don't believe in using microwaves, you can certainly melt it on your stove top. Just be mindful that you don't burn the butter, that you're only looking to melt it, and be mindful that your milk doesn't boil over because milk can bubble over very quickly. I'm going to heat the milk, I'm going to melt the butter, and I'll be back. I've heated my milk too far, so I'm just going to sit this to the side and I will bloom my yeast in there in a few moments once it's had time to cool a bit. In the meantime, we can go ahead and measure our flour. Typically, I would go ahead and pour the milk in here and bloom the yeast directly in here with that warm milk. But as I said, I heated the milk too long and I do not want to kill my yeast. It's actually a live microbe. With that being said, we want the yeast to be able to give our baked goods volume and make nice fluffy work for us. So we do not want to risk killing it. So I will be proactive and do something else while I'm waiting for my milk to cool a bit. So what we will do is begin measuring our flour. We will need about 8 cups of flour. The recipe calls for 4.5, but I'm gonna gauge it at the 8 and play the last cup by ear. It's going to be kind of a sticky dough. It is an enriched dough because it has milk and butter fat incorporated into it. So it's going to be more tender than your typical dough. Don't be tempted to add more and more and more flour. It will give you a dense, tough end result. And that's what we do not want. So let's begin measuring. Now I do recommend you either sift your flour with the sifter, or if this is too much trouble, I find it easier just to measure the flour right over a mesh strainer. I love this. I can use it for many purposes. I'm gonna allow this to sift for me. It will just make more convenient work since we're doing a larger quantity of flour and I have only this small little sifter. Make sure that you mise en place. You get all of your components out and ready with the exception of the dairy. Keep that in the fridge until the recipe calls for it, but just be certain that you have the amount that you need to complete the recipe. You'd hate to begin a recipe and not have what you need to function and have to run out to the store, and it would just be a big inconvenience. Just going to begin scooping my flour. I also have a butter knife and I'm going to use the straight edge, not the curved edge. I'm going to use the straight edge to scrape the top off, just like we did in our pancake video, to make sure that I have a level scoop. Tap, 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 knock out the air pockets to make sure you have a true cup, and scrape. I'm going to use a whisk just to get that flour down through the strainer. Now, that was 4. Let's continue. The amount of flour you use in baked goods depends on the humidity levels in the air in your location. Some areas have more moisture in the air, thus they would need a little bit more flour. So it's good to play the last bit by eye so that you don't over flour your dough and that it does not become tight and dense. So sift it, rest that there for later if we need more. When you're working with breads, you want to use a dough hook. If you have a standing mixer, your mixing bowl came with likely 3 attachments. The dough hook, the paddle, which looks exactly like that, a paddle, and the whisk. Those are the 3 main ones. The dough hook you want to use for all your forms of dough. It will not over aerate it, and it will also not get stuck and caught in the other attachments. This is the tool for the job. Back to our milk. Now what you're looking to do is get your milk lukewarm, a little bit above room temperature, but not so hot that it is going to kill our yeast. What we're doing now is blooming the yeast. So yeast grows rapidly in a warm temperature, and also if you add the sugar at this stage, it will feed the yeast. Feeding the yeast allows it to grow more rapidly. So we're going to incorporate our yeast and sugar into the warm milk. And we'll let that sit for a couple of minutes until the yeast gets foamy and you know that it's activated. We will need 5 tablespoons of yeast. I got a lot of yeast to use. Let me tell you, I don't even like cinnamon rolls, but these things are good. So it's worth the effort. So at this point, I'm going to actually preheat my oven because I am going to use my oven as a warmer prior to baking to help rush this process along. So I'm going to turn my oven on and then turn it back off as soon as it's hot. By the time I'm ready to proof this dough, it'll be ready to go in there. Now, if you forgot to do this and you needed to go ahead and get your oven hot, preheat it to its lowest temperature. Once it alerts you that it's hot, then you can put your dough in there to slowly rise. You don't want to rush the process by putting it in too hot of an oven or too warm of an environment, because that will also kill your yeast. Remember, it cannot go above a certain temperature. By the time I am ready to put these in there, it will have had time to cool. Next step, we have our yeast. We need to add our sugar to this mixture as well. And again, I doubled the recipe, so I'm going to need 1 cup of granulated sugar. I use raw granulated, but if you have traditional, that's perfectly fine. Also, we're going to add our butter to this as well. You want a level scoop. So if you still have your knife available, you could just jiggle the sugar. It's a lot easier, but I'll save the time and be accurate and use my scraper. Scrape that level, see? So I'm going to add that to our milk mixture. Make sure that you're using the right tool for the job. If it calls for a liquid measure, use a liquid measure. They do vary. For all my liquid ingredients, I'm doing them in here except with the butter because it was solid when it started. I measured that as a solid ingredient and went by the tablespoons on the marking of the paper, then melted it down. But for my milk, it went into the liquid measure. For my flour and sugar, they went into the dry measuring cup. They're slightly different. You don't want to do all of this work and then mess up the recipe by using the wrong tool. So at any rate, you can see it's starting to get a little bit foamy. In the meantime, we'll get prepared for our next step. We need 4 eggs. Now when baking, it's best to pull your eggs out the night before or a few hours early so that they can be room temperature. I have a trick for you. Should you forget to take your eggs out, you can sit them in a bowl of warm water for a couple of minutes and that will bring them up to room temperature. Not boiling water, you just want to bring that temperature up because that will allow it to incorporate and emulsify into your baked goods more easily and give you a more tender crumb as an end result. So let's do that. Need 4. Now, I've covered my 4 eggs with warm water. Remember, I doubled the recipe, so check the recipe as you're making this. Print it out, follow it as a guide. You can certainly implement some of the things I'm suggesting here. I'm using this recipe, but I am using the skills I learned as I was instructed to do baked goods. I usually would not add the salt at this stage because salt has the tendency of deterring or stopping the yeast from growing. But since in this case we did things separately because I had overheated my milk, I'm going to go ahead and add my salt into the flour mix. Stir it around so once the yeast hits it, it won't affect it because it will be dispersed. Okay, so we need 2 teaspoons of salt. It enhances and brings out the flavors. So I heard my oven beep. I am going to turn it off so that it will be ready once we're ready. Using our oven as a proofer right now. Pink salt is a little more strong in flavor. I find that you don't need much of it. Love this thing, and although it was very expensive, I have to say it was so worth it because I've had it for like 18 years and it hasn't broken yet. Make sure you properly clean your machine when you're putting the hook on and off. If your machine is dirty, you could knock off crumbs and remnants into your batter and make it hazardous to eat. So remember to do your things decently and in order. Make sure your machine is properly cleaned before beginning, and remember that we want to put love in the pot, in the dish, on the plate, and not death. Mix this up, the egg and the yeast mixture. I added a tablespoon of vanilla extract. At this stage, we're going to add the liquid into our flour mix and bring it together. And it's still going to be wet and tacky, but I want to let it rest for about 5 minutes so that the flour can absorb the liquid. Okay, so it's all incorporated. I could see that there was nothing remaining at the bottom as the dough ball twirled. The dough is very sticky and tacky, and that's exactly what we want. I may not need very much of that reserved cup after all. So now at this stage, we're just gonna let the dough sit for a few minutes. It's not gonna get crusty that quickly, so I'm not gonna take it out the machine. I'm not gonna wrap it or anything like that. I'm just gonna let it rest for about 5 minutes, and then we will continue the kneading process. Three more to go. So let's take a look at what's happening. The dough is being kneaded. It's not as sticky. As you can see, it's very tender. It's still sticking to the bowl, which is what we're expecting at this point, but it's not directly sticking to my hands as I press it. It's nice and soft. This is an enriched dough because it has the egg and the milk, so I am actually going to keep kneading it. I might add just a sprinkle more of flour since it's sticking so much to the bottom, but I know it's going to be sticky. Remember, we're going to have to knead it a little bit on the table, so you want to have a little wiggle room to incorporate more flour so that the dough is not tough. The glutens are developing, so I'm just going to let that little drop of flour incorporate, and then I'm going to turn it off and wrap it in plastic and stick it in the warmed oven. Okay, change of plans. I'm actually going to put the dough into a buttered bowl because I want to wash out our mixer and make the frosting. Let this get its first proof. Really, I could have put it in an even larger bowl because it should double. So I may be retarding it by not having it in a bigger bowl. There we go. We have room to grow. This process is the part that requires patience. Baked goods, while they're not overly complicated to create once you get the basics down, you do have to be patient to make these things on your own. So patience is key. Let's get this on in the oven so it can proof. The process is beginning. You want to use a heat-safe bowl for this because the oven is pretty warm. We'll check it again in about 15 minutes. And once the process of rising has began, I'm going to pull it out so that it does not overproof. Hi, we're back. Dough's proofing. We'll take this moment to tidy up and get our workstation ready for the next stage. Okay, now we're going to make our frosting. We've moved to the whisk attachment to aerate our frosting, and this is pretty much a version of a simplified buttercream that I put a few tweaks on. I have a stick of butter and about 4 ounces of cream cheese that's been softened in here. If you know you're doing a recipe like this, it's best to leave your butter out about 4 hours prior to you planning on using it. And if you forget, which we do sometimes, you can soften it in the microwave. So I'm playing this completely by eye. I added a few splashes of vanilla extract. Keep in mind, you can have fun with this. You can flavor your frosting however you choose. If you want to add a little citrus zest, if you want to add a little bit of maple syrup or maple extract, almond extract, whatever the goal may be, you can certainly do it. You could certainly make sticky buns with the same recipe. Just add pecans to your filling, your sticky smear. When we get to that stage, you could sprinkle pecans in, and you could even add in a little nut flavoring at this stage. Like if you wanted to do a bear claw inspired one, I'd add some honey to the smear to give you that taste, or even a little bit of almond paste, and then you can add almond extract to your frosting. So keep in mind, once you learn the base, you can tweak it and play with it and make it your own. So we're just looking for a spoonable consistency. You don't want it to be extremely thick, and at the same time, you don't want it to be too loose. I'm gonna beat it a little longer to aerate it, get more volume in there, and then I'm gonna taste it and I'm gonna tweak it. Okay, we'll be back. I added more lemon zest, lemon juice, and a splash of vanilla. I'm gonna bind it together and set this to the side, and then we'll finish working with our dough. Beautiful, look at that. Frosting done, we'll set this to the side. Now you can make this ahead, put it in an airtight container, label it and date it, and store it in the fridge. And when you know you plan to serve cinnamon roll, bring it out of the fridge at least 30 minutes or so early so that you can scoop out your portions to dollop on top of your cinnamon rolls. Look at that, our dough has nearly doubled. So we're gonna start working with it. Our first proof is done, but don't get too excited. We still have to proof once more. But now we can assemble. So let's do it. Nearly doubled. As I said before, we're gonna have to proof it again, but we need to get the dough assembled. Take it out. It feels so nice. It's like a big fluffy cloud. I've lined my whole work surface with a big piece of parchment because I want to be able to get the dough off the counter. Now when you're adding your filling, you don't want to add it all the way at the end. Furthest away from me, I'm going to leave about 1 inch without filling so that it won't ooze out. So I'm going to spread it all around, even up to the edges, just not coming completely to the edge. We'll leave about 1/8 of an inch here because when you roll it, filling's going to spread out. So here's where the parchment comes in handy. You can use it to help you lift and roll. So I'm just going to start in the corner and pinch down. And try to keep this guy nice and even. So I'm twisting and pinching, just like you would crimp a pie crust for the most part. I want that center roll to be nice and tight so that it all stays together nicely. Yank and pull and curl over. Now we'll start rolling. Doing the same motion, but using the paper to help us. And it to be nice and tight. We're making a sushi roll. You can gauge it better without the paper, but the paper does still help to lift it up. I'm squeezing and distributing, so you know it may feel very thick in the middle. You can kind of squish the filling down the line as you're rolling to kind of make the roll uniform. So just continue this process. You can start from the center to help you with that. You may have to stretch the edges. Now, our goal is to try to make a uniform log. Tuck the edges, make them look nice as you get to them. See, this is why we didn't overfill it, because it's still going to squish out as you move along. I'm going to stuff this back in on the end, lifting up and just pushing it in there. Mold it nice. Remember squishing. If it's too thick in one area, move the filling and the dough down by using this squeezing, kind of sort of gently, but controlled pressure. I'm going to cut it in half. And then I'm going to put both halves on the sheet pan in the freezer. I don't want to freeze it, but I want them to be semi-firm so that I can cut it without everything squishing out. So in back, I have a sheet pan lined with parchment paper. Don't waste the paper here. You'll need this to bake. I have my slicing knife. I recommend this for working with this dough, or a serrated knife. So we're just going to gently slice it without squeezing and pressing, because you don't want to make the filling come out. And actually, I think what I'm going to just get rid of this paper and use it to help me lift my rolls. Had I not crawled off of the paper, it would have been much easier. I'm going to use the paper and also put this in with my hand to move this guy. One log on. Beautiful. Let's get our other half. This will make it easy moving. Shake it. Okay, back to our cinnamon rolls. My rolls have been in the freezer for about 30 to 40 minutes, and now they're perfect to work with. I have my dough rolls here, and we're going to slice these guys up and get them on the sheet pan. Whatever I'm not cooking, I will finish freezing so that they can individually freeze, or IQF, which is called individually quick frozen, so that when I want cinnamon rolls, all I have to do is pluck one out of a baggie and bake them. And now we'll just start breaking it down in halves. Some simple math here. You don't want to apply too much pressure because you don't want the filling to ooze out. So we'll just go in half, and then we'll make thirds. You can mark it before you cut it to score the dough. Once they're hard and fully frozen, I will put them in a labeled Ziploc bag. They will be labeled fresh cinnamon roll dough with today's date, and I'll be able to pluck them off and bake them as I need to. We have to proof them one more time. So we will just proof them until they puffed up and almost double in size. Final step, baker's trick, is to pour over a little heavy cream, or you could use half and half. Baked goods need fat in order to be tender and moist, some sort of fat. So this is really that key factor that is going to give you that Cinnabon type cinnamon roll. And I poured about a tablespoon over each one. Again, these things are dangerous. You should eat them in moderation, and it is not something you should have all the time. However, I've added the cream. I'm going to cover them in plastic wrap. I'm going to preheat my oven to 170 degrees, which is the lowest setting, and I'm going to let them proof in there until they've almost doubled in size. They'll look plump, they'll look fluffy and poofed up, and once they've grown and doubled, then I'll remove them from the oven and heat the oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit and bake them for about 17 to 20 minutes, or until they're golden on the top. Hey family, I'm back. Just wanted to show you our cinnamon rolls before they go in the oven. They're proofed and beautiful. Let me give you a closer look. See, they've doubled in size. You can see the gases are trapped in there. It's kind of inflated. Now I'm going to take the plastic off. You definitely wouldn't want them to get too large because they would overproof and all your hard work would be to naught. The cinnamon rolls are all done. Yum. You want to allow them to cool for about 10 minutes before you put the glaze, or it all will just melt off. So I'm gonna glaze them and plate. Remember to share on your other social media platforms, and don't forget to swing by my channel. Until next time.